Welcome here to the Durfee Innovation Society. As Kyle mentioned, I am Diallo Smith. I am the president and chief operating officer of Life Remodeled. Life Remodeled is a Detroit-based nonprofit that's focused on neighborhood revitalization. And our motto is that we bring organizations and communities together to build neighborhood revitalization that lasts. The way we do that is in a very unique way. We look for disinvested neighborhoods that have large properties, vacant properties in them, such as schools, and we repurpose them for community assets. So you are right now sitting in the former Durfee Elementary Middle School. It was opened in 1927 as a feeder school to Central High School, which many of you passed by when you came here, which was the first public high school in the city of Detroit. As you all know, our city and to some degree our state has gone through some challenging times, and so part of that was depopulation. And at one point in time, this used to be a thriving school, a thriving population of young students, as well as Central. It reduced in that population, and so they made the hard decision of combining both of those schools together. So right now, Central is a K-12 campus. This school went vacant, and it was set to be on the demo list. And we had an invitation by the school district to think of something creative that we could do with this space. And we're like, this is 144,000 square feet in the middle of what some people will call the hood or the neighborhood. So we have to think very creatively about, okay, how are we going to utilize this space in a way that not only is going to be a benefit for the community members that live here, but also for the entire city. And so we took a very unique approach, as I'm sure you all have been talking about today. We took a community-driven design approach. What that means simply is this. The people who are embedded in this neighborhood, the Mrs. Jones who have been living here for 50 years, the barbershop owners, the teachers, the students, the parents, they know more about what is valuable and needed in their neighborhood more than me, you, or anybody else ever would. So it makes sense to tap into their genius, and which is exactly what we did. So we simply had extensive conversations with all of those stakeholders I just mentioned and asked them, what are the largest opportunity gaps that you see that can be filled by this place? And they mentioned to us jobs, economic mobility. That was almost number one. More access to health and wellness services, and more opportunities for their students, for their young people to have access to after-school programming. And so based upon that feedback, we then went out and we sought the best and brightest nonprofits, one at a time, that were moving the needle in those core areas to bring them to be partners in this building so that we could bring direct services and direct impact to the community. So right now, there are 35 incredible nonprofit and social impact organizations that are here in this space. We collaborate, we convene together, we talk about the problems that exist, not only in this neighborhood, but across the city. And then we find ways creatively and collaboratively to bring impact here. So right now, the Durfee Innovation Society, as of last year, we serve 28,000 Detroiters a year. We are at 100% occupancy. And every day when we wake up, when I wake up and put our shoes on and put our in my case suits on, they call me suits. I don't know why they get that from. We start with this one assumption and this one why, the biggest why. This is probably the why everybody is here. We believe wholeheartedly that Detroiters have all the talent that they need, but many don't have access to the opportunities that they deserve. And so we're thankful for M&A and other organizations like that for being really support partners for us. We are members and we utilize many of the resources that they provide every year, such as, if many of you probably access the annual compensation report and other tools, and I'll just give a quick glimpse on that. By the way, I'm going to make a shameless plug. This is a book that we collaborated and conspired to write together called Next Level Nonprofit. Just provides a blueprint for not only how we did what we did here, but also how other organizations can grow in their organizational and their administrative capacity to truly bring impact that lasts. But we use that report because, as many of you are all doing, you're trying to find the best talent And guess what? Sometimes talent takes compensation. And so we use that report to be a guidepost of how we can find the best talent by compensating them well. So I want to thank the M&A for providing that report every year because it's a blueprint for us. So I'm going to get out of your way. I know you guys had a play date outside, right? We'll call it that, a play date outside, and now you're eating. I hate going on while people are eating because some people have food in their mouth, other people are getting the itis. So I'm going to step aside. I'm going to let the program continue. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Diallo. I think there's no fitting place for us to hold this than in a space where benefit for the public good remains. It started out with students and now it rests with community organizations. And it's a fitting space for us to hold this community engagement conversation. So I hope you are enjoying lunch and the break session. And then this afternoon, we're going to explore what democracy looks like when everyone is counted in the census and all participate in voting. In today's panel, and I'll ask our three panelists to come up and I'll introduce you as you're getting seated. How was that for choreography? Today's panel will share how Michigan can lead the way in building people-centered, healthy democracy where we all are voices in shaping our collective future. I'd like to introduce today's panelists. We have three that are joining us. These are renowned experts in engagement. So first, John C. Yang, who's the president and executive director of the Asian Americans Advancing Justice. We have Mita Anand, who's the senior program director for the Census and Data Equity at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And we have Michael Davis Jr., sitting on the end, who's the executive director of Promote the Vote. Please join me in welcoming our panelists, and we'll get the conversation started.
Thank you all again so much for being here today at our first Civic and Community Engagement Summit. My name is Nellie Tsai. I'm the Social Innovation Officer with the Michigan Nonprofit Association, and I get to ask these really important and smart people questions. Really thinking about what we talked about this morning, what we heard from Dr. Jeff Williams about the state of the electorate and where we can go from here. I thought it was a really interesting perspective about who voted this time, the trends that led us to this place, but also an opportunity for us to think about how this impacts our work on the ground from the organizations that all of these people work with, and also what it means when we look forward. As we look towards 2028, 2046, as the electorate and America changes a lot, demographically, age-wise, all of these things will affect that charts, all the different charts that Dr. Williams showed this morning. So I just want to ground our conversation there. It would be remiss of me not to start a panel or any sort of situation for myself actually, without a quote. And the quote that brings me here today is one from Grace Lee Boggs. For those of you know, a famous Detroiter, activist, and really thinking about what it means to ground our work in community. And she once said, and this is a quote I've been coming back to a lot recently, is, "You cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself belonging to it, and responsible for changing it." So many people here that we know in our communities don't see themselves in any of those buckets. And we saw that play out time and time again. Our country right now is very different than how our Constitution wrote it. The democracy, the systems that we work with, was imagined in a time of wild imagination, but they could not have imagined us here in this place now, the people standing on this land 200 years. So what kind of wild imagination rides can we take from their groundwork? So that's kind of the invitation and the starting point for this conversation today. So let's go back in time just a little bit, 2 weeks, because we all have different perspectives and different work, right? So just thinking about, first, what did the last few weeks and last few months really show you about the importance of your work, or even just what our communities look like right now from your perspective? What did the election show you?
Have to thank Joan and M&A for the invitation to come here. It's a real pleasure to be here. my organization is based in DC. I'm based in New York, and as I've said to anyone who will listen, this is my third visit to Detroit this year, also the third time in my life. Love Detroit, love Michigan, did not know I had that part of my life hiding as a New Yorker, but so I do. So, the work I do at the Leadership Conference is grounded in ensuring that we have the most inclusive and accurate government data sets. So y'all know about the census. I saw it on a screen earlier. It's always being talked about, but it's really about, are we seeing our communities being properly reflected in data sets that are used for a range of policy making and funding decisions? And I don't have to tell this room, but our most underserved communities are the ones that don't show up in data sets. So it perpetuates a cycle. So how is my work relevant in this moment, and what has this moment caused me to reflect upon? So the relevance is, in 2020, we had a census, and that led to a reallocation of seats in the House. So one of the things, and this didn't come up actually ultimately in the election, but one of the things was the distribution of electoral college votes was different this time than it was in 2020, because what we had between 2020 and today was the reallocation of seats in the House, and certain states, like my state of New York, lost a seat. Certain states gained seats, like Texas and Florida, and if we have time, I have more to say about that later. But, so right there, it impacted the landscape. People who were doing pre-election analysis were saying there was actually a chance that Nebraska 1, is it Nebraska 1 or Nebraska 2? Nebraska 1 would be the number that got the winning, the victor to 270 and then to the presidency. And it was down to that because of the reapportionment that took place constitutionally after the census took place. So right there, basic, like, so that's the work on the census having an impact right away. Everyone talks about redistricting. Obviously, who shows up and who's drawing the lines, and it's intertwined, impacts who you get to vote for when you go and vote. I'm a poll worker. I watch people show up at the poll site saying, but I normally vote at that table. And they say, actually, redistricting happened since, and you're now in a new district, and you're now voting for someone new. All right, so but I want to get into like, what about now? We've had 2 weeks to think about the election. And I'd say there are 3 lessons that really came through for me. And we've heard some of them today, I know, which is like, how are we connecting to people? How are we connecting the dots? I can sit here, I can talk to you about democracy, I can talk to you about like, data is important, and I am so happy to talk about that all day long, that's my job. But we need to be able to connect that to how it impacts day-to-day lives. What is the connection to not just economic issues, but issues of fairness, issues of how do we show up in society, make those connections. The second one is related, it's the messaging, right? So we need to do the work of connecting the dots, and then we need to make sure other people understand the dots we're connecting. Now my third one, this is a battle over how we define ourselves and how we see ourselves. I think xenophobia has driven a lot of the current cycle. And I think when we look at work in the census, and I can go more into this, but there are fundamental questions going on right now where we do not ask a citizenship question on the decennial census, and there are very good reasons why we don't do that. But people want to see it because they want to start defining who counts, who is part of our society, and who is not. And they want to have control over, and my they here is anyone, I'm not speaking, but I'm just saying There is a battle over who has control over defining who is here, who has control over defining how you show up, who has control over what the data say, and how we interpret them and apply them to issues like voting and your district and getting money, and ultimately who gets to tell the story of who we are as a nation.
Great, thanks, Mita. Hello to everyone, and thank you for having us here. I think I want to just focus on a couple of issues. One around data, second around visibility, and third around what this means. Recognizing that this is right after lunch, people might be developing some food coma, I'm actually going to do a survey very quickly. And the survey is, so my organization is an Asian American nonprofit organization. So I'm going to start by asking you all, and there's no judgment whatsoever, to see if you know how many Asian Americans are here in Michigan. I will tell you that the numbers I will use is 0 to 2%, 2 to 5%, 5 to 8%, or over 8%. So let me ask, over 8%, show of hands, how many people think that there's over 8% Asian Americans here in Michigan? Okay, we have maybe about 10%. 5 to 8%. Let's see, maybe a third. 2 to 5%. Okay, maybe another 10%. And 0 to 2%. No one. Okay. The right answer is about 2.5%. So this is something that's worth knowing. In terms of knowing our communities and knowing having visibility in our communities, that's a good place to start. The reason I always start with numbers is also when we talk about the elections, one of the most frustrating things to me, and I will admit this up front, is if you were watching the election night coverage, you were starting to get data on how men voted, how women voted, data on different ages, how they voted, rural versus urban. You also had data on African Americans, Latino Americans, white Americans. And then what about Asian Americans? We were the other. Literally, that's the category that we fell into. Other than NBC News, everyone else did not have any data on Asian Americans. So that's also important to understand, like when we talk about the American electorate, like are we actually getting data that we need? So my organization actually did do what we call election night polling. We started actually 5 days before the elections, recognizing that there were people that were voting by mail, voting early, in person, et cetera. So just so everyone knows what this looked like for the Asian American community. For the Asian American community, about 61% of our community voted for Harris, about 35% voted for Trump. Compare that with 2020, it was a shift of 6%. In 2020, there was about 66% or 67% that voted for Biden, and about 35% or 34% that voted for Trump. So it was a shift. So that's one thing to recognize, right? And then if you break that down into different communities, Chinese Americans are probably, and I'm Chinese American, the closest with respect to the Harris versus Trump split at about, I think it was 54% to 39%. With respect to Harris, 54%, Trump, 39%. The reason I also talk about this aggregated data is that when you look here in Michigan, when you look at any state in the country, recognizing that Asian American, that notion is also just a monolith that needs to be broken down, right? So here in Michigan, one of the things that we always look at is when we talk about access, how do we need to get access to the community? It's important to recognize that 81% of Michiganders, I think I got the term right, hopefully. Yes, thank you, okay. 81% of Asian American Michiganders use a language other than English at home. Yes. A third of Asian American Michiganders are considered limited English proficiency. So if we're talking about how we reach out to our Asian American community here in Michigan, then you gotta start thinking about languages. And what does that mean for languages? If you look at the census data, and this is why census data is important, the top languages, Asian languages, are Chinese, Bengali, which is probably not something people normally think of, Hindi, Korean, and Vietnamese. So if we're talking about outreach, let's think about what that means. So I wanted to start by presenting certain pieces of data because I want us to think about, all right, what communities are we not thinking about? What communities are we not gathering data on? Because that also will inform us about how we engage in our community. Certainly, as I think about the election results, and we could talk about it later, is like how we're reaching out, where the disconnects are between some of the issues that we see versus how people voted. So let me stop there for now.
And again, thank you all for having us and having this panel. I'm Michael Davis Jr., the Executive Director of Promote the Vote, and we are a coalition organization, right? So we have NAACP of Michigan, ACLU, League of Women Voters, Detroit Action, Access. So one, we came together back in 2021 to participate in the redistricting process, and we put together a unity map, right? Knowing that the delay in census, the issues with the census, the delay in data, and the impact that that had on our Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, we assembled our partners and allies, and we had a mapping advisory committee to really look, in the absence of data, what the commission looked at was communities of interest. So geographically, as defined by the members of those communities, they submitted individual maps to do their best to contribute to the process of helping to draw the maps to be more representative. We went through that process in 2021. There was lawsuits and challenges, and we just finished a redraw again in 2024, which our State House maps just completed their first cycle on those maps, right? And we saw expected results on the map as drawn. Now, in terms of Promote the Vote, and where our goal is to eliminate disparities and access to the ballot, right? So Election Day was almost the culmination of our work, right? As we have gone through the election season, a successful election season, we worked the 866 Our Vote hotline, making sure that we are connecting with anybody that has an issue on the ground. They're calling in, we're running the hotline to make sure that we're solving issues for voters on election day and all through that process, right? So, 2 weeks out, we are still looking at the numbers, but our past ballot initiatives and the improvements and advancements that they offered to Michigan voters, we're still kind of looking at those numbers. Happy that we are increasing access to the ballot and secure ballot, just in a space now of kind of balancing that in the political climate.
Thank you all so much for those different perspectives. I think the really good through line that we're all drawing here is that all these systems that we have, or all these ways that we have been invited to participate in our society, from the census and on, really impacts a lot of the work we do. And one of the threads that you guys, all of you, touched on was this idea that there are invisible communities, or people who are choosing to not participate in any of these, participate in the census. They don't see themselves there based on the questions. They don't see themselves in the poll data. So why do people care? Michael, I know in one of our calls, our panel calls, you talked about how and where people vote also really impact, and depending on how that is, people don't necessarily see it as a action that they should take, that it's not necessarily for me, or you made my polling place so far away that I don't actually want to do this anymore. So what are some ways that we can continue to invite people into these big conversations and these important decisions that we're having right now? What are some actions that we can take to do that?
Well, that's the question, right? So,
Big question, yeah, absolutely.
so I'm going to start small, and then I'll go back into like Mita's philosopher mode. But so most people here, actually, I'm going to do a John. So how many people here have heard of the American Community Survey? Pretty good. Okay. I'm going to call it ACS for short, right? But the American Community Survey is technically part of the decennial census, even though it's not, right? And it's the evergreen survey that goes to 1 in 40 households. Every year it goes out, and that's the really long survey that asks 75 questions. And these questions are on things where people are like, why are you asking me this? So it's like stuff like, how many toilets are in your house, to what's your income, how many languages do you speak, where were you born, things like that. When you read a newspaper article or listen to NBC News, like they are going to be citing underlying detailed granular statistics. Those statistics come from the American Community Survey. Every question on the American Community Survey is there for a statutory purpose. That's because Congress passed a law where there needs to be some underlying data collection that supports the implementation and continued administration of that law. Why am I going on and on about this? This is the most important data collection vehicle that you've never heard of, if you're one of the people that never heard of it. And those of you that have heard of it, I hope you hold it dear to your heart and mention it, because one thing we can always do is uplift the importance of the American Community Survey to any groups we are serving. The problem with the American Community Survey is it doesn't go to everyone. So all you can do is a general education. But to me, that's an important moment. I actually believe that data collection is part of democracy. We need to be represented in the data in order to be able to access what we need. And one of the ways of being represented in the data is through the American Community Survey. And the groups that are least likely to fill it out, again, we know this, I did this already, right? Like the underserved are the ones that are not going to fill it out. American Community Survey is only administered in English and Spanish. Which communities are we missing with that? The other reason I'm bringing up the American Community Survey is there is a Federal Register notice out right now, the regular 3-year re-up of the American Community Survey. And what we want to do is mobilize as many individuals and organizations as possible to write a comment letter talking about why the American Community Survey is important to them and how important it is, because there are certain members of Congress that would want to get rid of it or to make it voluntary. And when you have a voluntary survey, you get really bad statistics. You get inaccurate, unusable statistics. So what can we do? We can protect the American Community Survey. The Office of Management and Budget has another activity out right now where they're asking groups to comment on their plans for community engagement. What does public participation look like? That is another moment of being able to engage in democracy and make sure that as we are engaging in it, we're thinking of the things that John pointed out, like what language are we using? And I don't mean just like, are we speaking Chinese or English? Are we using language that people can understand? Are we communicating to them about the importance of it in a way that's comprehensible? So I said I was going to get philosophical. I'll leave it for later. But like the point is, like, there are things now where we can look for opportunities for input and engage our communities as we do that. And in doing that, we're talking to people about the importance of this engagement. And I truly believe that that helps us get to a better count on the ACS, on the decennial census, and that type of civic engagement ideally translates over to the voter process. So those are my thoughts for now.
Well, thanks. And I think I would go back to where, in some ways, where I started, which is like meeting people where they're at. And like for the Asian American community, it's about language, right? And making sure that we have that language access and recognizing that it looks different. Because it's great that Mita mentioned the American Community Survey. One of the things that there's a common misperception that Asian Americans are what would be considered first adopters for technology, that we don't have any issues, that we are overachievers in many ways. It falls into that, what we always see as what we call the model minority myth. The American Community Survey says that only 3% of Asian Americans do not have broadband access. But as Mita noted, this is only done in English and Spanish. It doesn't have really any outreach in Asian languages. So when we do our own surveys, we find that actually it's probably double that, around 7%, a little bit over double that. Now even there, now let's be real, like people will say, well, 7%, that's still not a lot. What 7% means is about 1 in 12 households do not have broadband. Think about what that means for the kids in those households. Think about what that means for the individuals that are trying to pay bills or get health care in those households, right? So like on one hand, you could see me, I like talking about numbers because I think numbers can be very motivating, but I also want to humanize that, is that like some of these numbers, when we talk about 7% or Asian American population only being 2.5%, sounds like, well, that's not quite statistically significant. And I would want to challenge us to make sure that we understand that those are real people. It actually amounts to quite a few people that we need to serve in a better way. The place that I would want to end on this is that with a place of actual hope, which is when it comes to voting, actually Asian Americans are starting to show up in much greater numbers. So in this most recent election, 1 in 8 Asian Americans were first-time voters. They've never voted in an election at all. Over the last 3 election cycles, so it would be 2020, 2022, and 2024, almost 40% of our voters were first-time voters. So what this suggests is that if we are doing our outreach correctly, and this could be on anything, it doesn't just have to be voting, it could be on census, it's on any type of services that all of us are trying to offer. If we're doing our outreach correctly, there is a population that can be reached, a population that wants to engage, as long as we are meeting them where they're at, whether it's with respect to language, as in language access. I agree with Mita, language also means in terms of simplicity of language, right? Recognizing that many of our communities, sort of, if you think about a ballot referendum, how understandable is that actually to our general population, and making sure we get to them so that it's understandable.
And just getting back to his point in terms of being represented in the data and just access. So one, I will lift up Senate Bill 402, right? We are pushing to have that representation in Michigan to create a data institution that will look at the numbers and help dive into that. And I'll also give a plug to the ACS. In the absence of that 2020 survey data, we leaned on the ACS to help lift up communities so that we could help with that, help put together our unity map and bring that representation. But just the work again, the Arab Community Center for Economic and Social Services, the work that they've done in Southeast Michigan over the years, connecting with communities for 50 plus years, Detroit Hispanic Development Corporation and the work that they do in Southwest Detroit and beyond, connecting, helping to get the word out, right? It's not about just having access. A lot of the time and the effort that we put in was in as we expanded voting rights, right? Wanted to make sure that everyone had access and education, knowing that those rights were expanded in the different times. So we translated. We also run MichiganVoting.org website. It's strictly how to register, how to get involved, how to vote. Translating all of those resources in Spanish, Spanish, Bangla, and Arabic, right? Making those available online, printing those off for partners to distribute in those communities, right? To make sure that we are continuing to bridge that gap. We worked with Disability Rights Michigan to revamp that Know Your Rights Guide, right? To make it as nuts and bolts and as common sense and as understandable and accessible as possible, right? It doesn't do us any good to expand voting rights and do all this great work if folks don't have the means to get access to these resources, right? When you print the ACS in 2 languages and then ask questions, and you get skewed data on the back end. So just, again, highlighting the ACS and commending our partners that are in the community, the boots on the ground, right? Not just Promote the Vote partners, but in the whole election protection space that are doing the work and the trusted messengers in their communities, right? Like Promote the Vote can say one thing, but unless they're hearing it from someone that means something to them, that's when our job is done, once we can connect those dots and help those resources flow.
For sure, and I think one of the things that I was hearing from all of you is also this idea of how important it is to involve community in all of the work you're doing in order to, when you talked about the different polling you had to do to really paint a different picture of what's not being said in the ACS, Michael, all of the work you've had just outlined there around community building, coalition building, why are you expanding voter access, and how do you know the best way? Like, what are the access points that people need, as well as around the actions we can take with census and really organizing, getting people involved with these things. So what are some successes? Because a lot of this work, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. These voting rights haven't been expanded by itself. It took voices. How did you invite people to participate and show them how important it was so that we could do some of this great outreach, coalition building? What are some key tactics or strategies that you've had in building this groundswell for you all?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so just to take a step back as to the organization I work for. I am at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. We are a coalition that's been around for 75 years, 240 member organizations. So I often interface with member organizations such as John's. So I am not an on-the-ground person, except we also run something called the States Count Action Network, which is how Joan knows me. And we also run the Data Disaggregation Action Network, which actually there's some members of that network here too. So what we do is we provide resources, toolkits, empowerment to allow people to have ways to connect with their communities around data and data's importance. So there's that, right? Talking about data, why do we care, bringing together stories of why we are looking to collect data and why it's so important to underserved communities. The other thing is, before I had this job, I ran New York Counts 2020, which was a coalition of organizations working for a fair and accurate census in New York. And there, on the ground, we were hearing certain things. And these things included, I don't like these race and ethnicity questions. And you kind of alluded to this earlier. People didn't see themselves in the question. People who are LGBTQI+, didn't like the questions because there was a question of like, if you have a same-sex partner in the household, but there was no other way to identify yourself. I also do some work with the disability justice community, and there's been a lot of issue around how questions are asked to determine whether or not you have a disability, and whether disability is an identity or is it an enforcement issue or an access issue. So I'm telling you all these things because these things came up, and people stood up and said, I want to see new race and ethnicity questions. And we got those pushed through for now. What people, are fighting to see a sexual orientation, gender identity question in the American Community Survey. And there are really deep conversations going around, what should our questions asking about disability data look like? Because what happened there was the Census Bureau announced new categories, and the disability justice community said, no one talked to us about this, what are these? And so it's very much about like standing up and saying like this, if you want to measure my community, you need to be engaging with my community to understand how to measure it. So to me, it's that. So the successes I've seen have been in seeing the change to the race and ethnicity standards, in seeing the Census Bureau take a step back and say, okay, we need to rethink how we're doing these disability data questions. And for now, seeing steps to seeing sexual orientation and gender identity included in surveys. And that didn't come, like a lightning bolt from the sky. That came from community engagement and organizing, and communities saying like, I want to see myself on this form, and I want to be represented in the data.
Yeah, a lot of this, I think, does really the hard work is the work that you all are doing. On the ground, in small conversations. It really is small kitchen table type conversations. Because what I see, my organization is based in DC, there's this disconnect between some of the survey data that we see and what people are feeling. And here are a couple of examples. One would be around immigration. Certainly we see that there is currently a demonization around immigration and this notion that we maybe should be engaging in mass deportation. At the same time, when you start talking to people about it, and this appears in the survey data as well, certainly within the Asian American community, and this is true for most communities, about 74% of our community says, no, we shouldn't be deporting people just en masse. We should be finding different pathways, right? Certainly when you talk about DACA, Dreamer type programs, support is around 88%. And where that comes from is because when you start to humanize those individuals that are being affected, then people have a different view than when they're just hearing sort of the national landscape. So where I see success happening is when we're able to have those difficult conversations individually, sort of on the ground, and say, yeah, I understand what your concerns are, but here's the reality, right? And part of this reality is recognizing, again, I focus on the Asian American population because that's the population I know. When we talk about undocumented immigrants, 1 in 11 Asians here in the United States are of some undocumented status, right? So even if you're talking to a fellow Asian American that says, well, I came here the right way, that's the most typical trope. Why can't they come here the right way? Well, why is it that they came here the right way? It's because we created legislation to allow them to come here the quote-unquote right way. So let's have that conversation. That's not a conversation that can be had even in audiences as large as this, frankly. But it's a conversation that each of you can have, around with a group of 5 or 6 people that you can actually explore a little bit more in depth. You have a little bit more time to talk about what that means for your colleague, literally your next door neighbor that actually quote unquote might be illegal because they're out of status. If you start having those conversations, I think we get a different level of engagement.
For us, I think being a coalition and being part of a coalition, that is our strength, right? So we are the democracy arm or the democracy-focused entity for for Detroit Action, for ACLU, League of Women Voters, right? So while they are fighting the very real battles and servicing members of their community and carrying out that work, right, it is our job to make sure that as they have these conversations and they're having these, one-on-one conversations and moving the needle and trying to get people to get out and participate, that we're doing the work to make sure that it actually, happens on the back end. So, coming out of the 2020 election and all of the hubbub down at the TCF Center, and all of just the uncertainty around election results and what that meant, Promote the Vote, and our constellation of partners, our coalition partners, that is where Promote the Vote came out of, right? To be able to cut through partisan noise left to right and be able to say these are the common sense advancements that Michiganders want to see. These are the things that it's going to make it easier for them to access the ballot, for family members to access the ballot. So we really took that on in terms of that was our work. What's winning at the ballot has been a great success in helping to keep the coalition moving. In 2018, I think I mentioned we won in 80 out of 83 counties, but in 2022 it was down to 43 or 44 or something like that of 83 counties, right? So you could see in just that 4-year time, just kind of erosion of public trust in the process and in the system. So I think we are seeing success I take success in seeing record turnout for early voting, which is one of the provisions from our 2022 ballot initiative. Seeing folks take advantage of no reason absentee. So yeah, as I see the numbers grow and see more people in Michigan and more communities have access, taking the wins from that, but also seeing how things play out and continue to strategize to look for more advancements for the people of Michigan.
Thank you all so much. So really, civic engagement and community engagement really go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other, without really inviting communities in. And Mita, you mentioned earlier that you wanted to get philosophical for a moment. So I'm gonna bring that invitation to the rest of the group with a question around, in your wildest imaginations, what happens when everyone does participate? When everyone is voting and filling out the long census questions about how many toilet seats you have in your house and what color your blinds are, if you have curtains, stuff. Yeah.
So I think what we are seeing now writ large, and this is, I think, anyone, anywhere in this country, is the trust cycle just has been broken. And I think what I want to imagine, what I like to pitch is we see ourselves represented in the data, and then those data are used to create districts that are properly reflective of our underlying communities, that we're not seeing distortion and suppression and misuse of data, but then we are using these data to actually have tailored policies, to actually have representation that feels like a true representation of who we are, and that when we are looking at our data sets, we are seeing all of us. And when we have that, then you can start building that cycle of trust. Like, if I engage in this, I will get better results for myself and my community. Because we know people say, well, I filled that out last time, I didn't get a new school. Or, you made me fill out this ACS form that took me 45 minutes to fill out in a language I'm not comfortable with, and you tell me this helps my community get resources. What resources? And it's hard to explain the amount of steps that the data have to take between being collected and like tabulated and delivered somewhere, and some legislation happens along the way, and a line is drawn along the way, and someone else comes and says, you know, actually we're going to suppress these people's right to vote, and actually you don't count for the purpose of this type of data collection. You know, like determining who's even in the data set. So if we are able to reach that point of saying, like, no, we should all be in these data sets, be represented for who we are, and use that as a path forward for people to actually say, okay, government can work for me. I can actually make government work for me. But the starting point to get there has to be that full representation in the underlying data set.
Yeah, I'll pontificate with you. I would say to get to that point, our work, again, just wanting to make sure that we're helping partners and their communities just get that first interaction, you know, with the election system, right? Whether it's just a participation in a phone call, whether it's, you know, phone banking, whatever it may be, or if you actually take that step to voting. Once you get that step, we want to make sure that the communities and the folks that we work with, that they're sure that their vote counts, right? Like, we want to eliminate all, continue to build faith in the process, and by eliminating any questions around the system. And then lastly, one of the things that key to the work that we do is, you know, investing in the organizations, in the leaders that are in those communities, right? So there are a lot of re-grants that promote the vote, Michigan Voices, ACLU, as we fundraise for the nonpartisan election protection plan. A lot of the work, there was a lot of conscious effort to center the organizations and the folks doing that work and making sure that they were, you know, lifted up with resources and also, you know, actual support, right? Not just the resources, but funding and security to continue to do that work. Yeah, so that's how we get there, and I think I'm interested clearly to get there and see. I feel like it'll make for such a more robust, as Sharon would say, discourse in terms of having folks at the table, being able to connect the policy impacts to their everyday livelihoods. I think that's where you get the better discussions, right? Best discussions. We're doing work trying to figure out, you know, how folks, you know, voted one way or how they access the ballot in different, sorry, I'm going to tangent, in different ways, but just being able to dive into the numbers to really be able to put a finger on the issues as we talk to folks.
Yeah, I think one of the things, and we kind of talked about it when we were just huddling before this, is this notion that some of what all of this, whether it's voting, whether it's being counted in the census, those are necessary steps, but they're not sufficient. And that's perhaps something that all of us also, when we're talking to the people that we serve, we need to remind them of. And we just need to be very real with them, because I think there is a concern that people say, well, I voted for so-and-so, there's no change, why do I bother to vote? Well, I filled out the census, there's no change, why do I bother? The reality is you bother because that is necessary, but then you also need to remember that, like, we will help you in that. We in the nonprofit industry will help you to make the change that you see, but you also still have an ongoing role in it. Democracy is participatory in that way, right? So that we can't say, all right, you've done your part, and then we leave them alone. You've done your part, we're going to continue to engage with you because now I know that you want this new highway, you want this new school, and so we're going to work with you now after you voted to see that happen. So I think that's the piece that we all need. again, I will admit it as a fault of my own organization. I need to make sure that we are checking in with ourselves to make sure that we don't just stop after the election. We don't just stop after the census, but rather we say, okay, now that we have this, here's what we're going to do next.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It takes me a second to turn on and off the mic. Sorry about that. Absolutely. Voting is an important step. It's not the only step. And I did want to just small pivot here. You know, we're doing some very informal, not statistically significant data polling at all, but we do have some polls in the back asking people how they participate in civic activities in their communities, as well as ways that people can feel like spaces feel safe. What does community engagement look like for you in a way that makes it feel like you belong there? And you guys have touched on a lot of the different themes that people have, again, not statistically significant, have said, you know, having those meaningful conversations with each other, you know, being able to talk to neighbors or community members, seeing yourselves represented there, but also thinking about the different ways that people have participated in civic activities. You know, voting gets a lot of stars in that jar, I think. But also like local council meetings, community meetings, showing up when a nonprofit asks you to come and share your thoughts about proposals or initiatives that they're trying to do in their neighborhoods, because it feeds upwards into different ways that they can make a difference, and that's how you continue to build trust. So thank you for lifting all of those pieces up there. Before we pivot to, sorry, now I'm hearing Ross Geller's voice in my head. Forward there. Oh, good. We have time. I would love to ask you all, in terms of closing out the segment, maybe we'll have time for Q&A, but really formally, my last question to all of you is, what is bringing you joy these days? What is something that is still sparking your imagination? What is bringing you joy as you continue this work?
Is this work-related or personal?
Joy. What is
Okay.
bringing you joy, Mita?
All right.
Come
all
on.
right, I'll do both.
Please do.
I'm actually going on a cycling trip in Chile over Christmas, and I am going to a lot of spin classes to get ready. So, yeah. Now, personal aside, and I suspect my co-panelists are going to agree with this, but like having the coalition available as partners, as community partners. What is unusual right now for this time in the census space is that normally after the decennial census, people pay some attention, but like you don't have people whose full-time job is to work on census and data equity, and you don't have groups being engaged throughout the cycle. And after the 2020 census, such a powerful infrastructure had been built up that the decision was made to keep it going. And that means that, you know, I have a very happy census family. And being able to joke around with them over email, you know, like, briefly it looked like Linda McMahon. I don't know if any of you know who she is, world WWE woman, briefly was being floated as, yeah, and then SBA. She was briefly floated as Commerce Secretary. And so we were all like wondering, like, does that, because census falls under commerce, like, does that mean we get costumes? And there's like a whole email chain, like, what would your costume be? And it's just like really great. And now she's been named to the education department, and we're like, oh, does that mean we have to become education advocates if we want to wear the costumes? So, you know, being able to have that community that, you know, you're doing the work with, but then you can, you know, take your mask off and be yourself and joke around is really great.
Wait, before you pass, what was your suggestion for costume? Furiosa. Sorry, I'm bad at the microphone. Let me try that again. Before you pass the mic, I needed to know, what was your suggestion for the costumes?
Furiosa.
Furiosa, okay. Hope that's for the record.
I'm actually going to twist the question and start with what was hardest most about the election, but then what gave me joy. What was hardest most about the election, and I'm still going to get a little emotional saying this, was having to tell my daughter that we couldn't elect the first female president. My daughter is obviously Asian American, and so seeing a role model like that was something that she was really, really looking forward to. And so it was hard to say to her the next morning that that didn't happen. But at the same time, as I reflect on it, it gives me joy. It gives me joy that she cares so much. She sat up with me for a while watching the election returns. She follows that on sort of, and she actually talked to her friends about the election and the information that she's getting. And so that gives me joy because it gives me hope. It gives me hope that we do have a youth that is engaged. And if we actually engage with them in the right way and treat them like the adults that they are and not talk down to them, that gives me a lot of hope for the future.
What gives me, I mean, I think immediately after the election, we're just kind of, sitting there and looking at how our ballot initiative had increased access. But I think just what it means for internalizing what it meant for democracy, what gives me hope is the fact that I don't think anybody on the ground, my team and other folks in the election protection coalition, like skipped a beat, right? It was make sure we're there for the monitoring of the canvass and certification process. And, there's stuff to do. There's still things to do. So it was, yeah, I take solace in the fact that we've done this before and fought to advance democracy. So yeah, it was a real kick in the gut, but reading those email replies from my team the next day was what I needed, right?
Thank you. Thank you for sharing some of the community that gives you joy and also the ones that ground and claim you. Absolutely. We do have some time for some quick Q&A. We can take maybe 3 from the audience if you all are amenable. Don't be shy. I saw you guys all chatting before.
I'm just kidding.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Anthony Eid here with COTS, but I also lead the Michigan Redistricting Commission, so the census is very important to me. Mr. Davis, it's nice seeing you again. Thanks for all the help y'all did in helping us identify those COIs. Great job. Something that we know from the last census is that Detroit was undercounted. The mayor has made it his mission to try to rectify that. And recently, the courts did increase the number of citizens in Detroit to be more closely reflected to what it actually is. However, that doesn't really help now because redistricting was done in 2021. So, looking forward, especially in some of these communities that are really affected and might have apathy with filling out the census, how do y'all think that nonprofits and us as nonprofit professionals can help deal with that? And to go along with that, a positive thing I see is for the first time in the next census, hopefully it stays that way, knock on wood, but we're gonna have a checkbox for Middle Eastern, North African populations. And I happen to think that'll be transformative for our community because it's a rather large community here in Southeast Michigan. Reaching folks who are more apathetic about filling out the census, whether it be for reasons, administrative reasons, political climate, not wanting to fill it out, maybe for fear of the government knowing where they are, things like that.
Well, I think you half answered your own question, right? Like there is, for now, that is something I have a whole beyond the lookout category. I am worried that the new race and ethnicity standards will either not be implemented or rolled back. But I think pointing out that there are categories for people to actually identify with now because there are communities that did not feel included. I think that's huge. But I'm going to give my a deeper answer, we recently conducted ACS focus groups. Asked, like, just had focus groups, have you heard of the ACS? I mean, American Community Survey, ACS, showed them the form. These were fascinating. Like, we'd start, my favorite, by the way, was this woman who had never heard of the census, and everyone else in the room had, and she's just staring at them like, where have I been? And by the end, and it was a 1.5-hour focus group, and when we would start, maybe 10 to 12 people, 1 or 2 people would be like, I guess I'd fill it out, sounds like data important, sounds like it's good for my community. By the end, there would be 1 or 2 that would say, no, only 2 of them would not fill it out, and everyone else was all in. And this is not with Amita or John in the room or Michael. This is with, the hired moderator, and they talked themselves into it. It was fascinating. Like, they were like, oh, well, I guess they need these data for this purpose, and they're trying to understand our communities. And they talked themselves into the importance of the American Community Survey and the importance of filling it out. And they started coming up with ideas like, there should be a QR code. It should be in all languages. They should tell me what the data are used for up front. I shouldn't have to go hunt for it. And it was fascinating because they came up with the answers. We have actually presented these to the Census Bureau. This is what people on the street are saying you need to do to get me to fill out this form. But it was also that whole point of, like, sit down and talk to people. Just having, I mean, granted they got $200 for it, but like just having time to sit there and think about it and contemplate what it means. They are now ACS ambassadors. Like, they are now going around telling people why it's important. And so I think having that real non-transactional conversation, but also being very clear, what does it and does it not get you? We ran around in 2020 saying money, power, and in New York we also added respect. But sure, yes, after it goes through all of this. So let's be more real. Right? Like John said, necessary but not sufficient. Let's be completely clear what we're getting them and not sell them this false bill of goods that, like, the sun will always shine if you do this. But in fact, we need this to get to that better society we want, and we can't get there without it.
Well, one very quick thing was, so all of you, I think, have some knowledge of the federal government recently, they are implementing what's called SPD 15, which allows for disaggregation of data. Now, what that will happen, as Mita said, with the new administration, we're not sure. But one thing I'm curious about is, like, if this is something that this group believes in, there's nothing to stop the state of Michigan from doing this on its own. California does it. I think New York has a certain version of it. Like, if you believe in data, there's also things that you should be doing locally to make sure that you're getting that data. So in terms of practical advice that I would give you is, so think about what data that you want for your different communities and think about ways how you could implement it statewide or maybe even countywide if statewide doesn't work.
Hi. Hi, in the back. Thank you so much for your perspective. I want to share my question first, really appreciating what you said about the level of trust or distrust that folks have in our civic systems right now, especially from the communities and the coalitions you work with. When I think about some of the maybe most dramatic changes that we could enact to our election system over the next couple of years, ranked choice voting, is something with the ballot initiative that stands out as one of those more dramatic things. And I'm wondering from the perspectives of the communities, coalitions that each of you work with, what do you think there's a chance that something like that could be seen as a way, for the groups you work with, to take more control of the civic system for themselves and see more of their, interests represented, or do you see it differently? I'd just love to hear your perspectives.
So I can say confidently that I do see that as a way. I can't say, as coalition organizations will fall where they are, but I will say, as a voting rights organization, we are looking at, continually looking at advancements and reforms that will lead to more representational models. I think that's a safe answer.
Hi, thank you all for your insights. My name is Bill Arnold. I'm with the Michigan History Foundation. And I'm just trying to have a question about the information you're sharing in this notion in the value of surveying the census, the American Community Survey, having that data that informs policy. But I'm also hearing comments earlier from Jeff that showed us that, sort of this trend in America of not trusting government, so this dramatic drop in that, and also emphasize that only 1 or 20%, 1 in 5 podcasts are actually created by traditional, what we would think of as traditional media sources or news outlets, but they're actually individuals or small groups of individuals creating individual podcasts. And podcasts are where more of our younger population is turning to get their information. If they're independent or small groups that don't have to, that don't utilize this large data sets or have to rely on that, but can make up their own or do their own surveying and communicate it in private groups, and that's where more people are getting their information. And so my question is where might we be coming in conflict with those in terms of how people are engaging with that? Are they going to actually get the correct information and inform that, or if they're listening to people or they're getting their information from sources that don't rely on this actually scientifically supported and proven data sets, but random or even not data sets at all?
That's a great question. I mean, I think this takes us into, we could spend another whole day easily, right, on sort of like how people are digesting information, this misinformation, if not disinformation that is out there, right? And I think this is, again, you're right, government isn't necessarily trusted anymore. Media organizations, traditional media organizations are not necessarily trusted anymore. But you know who is trusted? I think you guys are, right? The populations that you all serve trust you. And so maybe that's one place to start, is to make sure that you all are doing your homework to get out the proper information. And when I say proper information, I don't have a political agenda on this one. It is making sure that we're getting facts. And if there are opinions out there, let's make it clear that this is an opinion, right? If we are trying to be honest with our own populations and struggling with them, I think that's where you start. The other aspect of this that is hard, recognizing that all of us are probably under-resourced, is recognizing that how we reach our populations now are different, right? That you can't go to traditional media. There's not a one-size-fits-all. That we need to sort of develop our own social media skills, our own small group skills in reaching, whether it's through a podcast, whether it's through a different Slack channel or a WhatsApp channel, right? To reach our populations. I know that's hard. That is absolutely hard, but I think that's the work that really is in front of us too, is figuring that piece out and really developing the resources to reach out to those groups.
So I will add something to that, which I think is fully additive, which is I think people shy away from difficult conversations, like all the time, in every arena, personal life, work life, but socially, community engagement, right? And I think part of it is leaning into those conversations, which sounds like a trope, but like actually saying, where did you get that information? This is what I've heard. And because sometimes we allow information to be out there without a counter, without saying the other piece of it. So we need to be able to engage in a conversation. And I will tell you, so I'm on Facebook. I have not posted in 6 years, but I stay because I'm a horrible lurker and I like to see like if my cousin's still being weird. And but my Facebook feed has things like, I won't talk to those people anymore. And it's from both sides of my Facebook feed. I see people just being like, I refuse to engage with X type of person anymore. And I can understand that anger. but then we're not going to get anywhere. Then we're just going to be more siloed. So we're going to have that conversation. The other thing, there was another point I wanted to make. I've forgotten it, but if I remember, I'll ask. Yeah.
I appreciate the comments about data as a tool to help understand communities, to help describe communities, even as a tool to build power in communities. So there are lots of folks that see the value of data, that use it in our daily work to inform decisions, that use it for advocacy in support of resources for communities. And we're concerned about what might come next. And so you alluded to this a little bit earlier. Can you talk about some of what we need to monitor and be aware of as we transition into this next phase of government?
And it fits into the answer to the previous question. So I think we're going to see a citizenship question added to the census. Why does this matter? Right? We actually have citizenship information. We get it through anyone? American Community Survey. Okay. So asking it on the decennial census leads to fear of persecution. Why do people want these data? So that leads to an inaccurate count, and again, an inaccurate count primarily of communities of color, immigrant communities, and adjacent to immigrant communities. We see that, but that's not the most scary part of it. Is the 14th Amendment calls for allocating seats in the House of Representatives based on a count of the whole number of persons in each state. That word whole is very deliberate. It's to be thought of in contravention to what used to be there. There you go. So, whole number of persons in each state. Persons is not citizen. Person has a very specific meaning. It means a person. A citizen means a citizen. There is a very deliberate, concerted effort to change how we are looking at the 14th Amendment to mean that we should only allocate seats based either on only citizens or only long-term permanent residents and citizens. That really shifts how we count people. I mean, everyone will still be counted, but how those numbers are allocated. There's going to be a shutting down of efforts of reaching out to communities of color and reshifting where the focus goes in the outreach. I'd say those are my top ones for now. I do think ACS will be made, there'll be attempts to make it voluntary, and overall data are going to be more inaccurate. We're going to see a rollback of Statistical Policy Directive 15, possibly, very likely. Why did this come up in my head in regards to the previous answer is, what we saw with this election was a shift of Latinos, Asian Americans, I mean everyone, right? But within that, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Black people towards voting for the Republican Party at the national level in a way that we hadn't previously seen. So that means that if you are going to assume that your communities of color or your immigrant communities are not going to vote for Republicans, you are making an incorrect assumption. So I think there is a bit of light there where we can have conversations and say, really? You don't want to count immigrants? Really? You want to suppress that? Are you that sure that they're not going to vote for you or your agenda? Because they've started to do that. So we have an opportunity to say, no, like you need to represent your whole constituency, which includes people who voted for you. So stop making these assumptions, because I think both parties are making assumptions as to who votes for them. And we need to take that moment to build those bridges and say, okay, we're looking at all of us and we're going to serve all of us. And that's going to be, I think, our pathway to how we try to combat some of these things coming down the pike.
I fear that one of the things I've ended up doing at this is giving you all more work. But to your question, I think this is one thing that I think all of us need to have on our radar is, what does privacy legislation look like? And this is legislation as appears to how government shares data, right? With each other in terms of interagency. So when we talk about census, actually within the context of the census, it is very clear legislatively that the Census Bureau cannot share personal data with other agencies. And that the Census Bureau civil servants are very absolute about that. I feel good about that. But obviously, can that legislation be changed? I suppose so. But then more generally, if we think about privacy legislation as it relates to sharing of data, whether it is with respect to immigration status, whether it is respect to any other number of things, right? Certainly there is that at the government level, but then we also have to think about at the private level with respect to how private companies might be sharing data with the government, or private companies are sharing data with each other. So again, this is something that I think we all need to have on our radar as nonprofit organizations, because we do benefit from that data. So we don't want to be in a position that we don't want that data. But I think we also need to have sort of go into this with open eyes, whether it's for my organizations thinking about what civil rights protections are necessary even if we're going to share data. Having those types of provisions, having provisions which allows for opt-outs, if you will, right, to the minimally necessary information that serves that community but cannot be used to harm that community. That's speaking, I admit, in somewhat generalities, but I think that's one of the things I would ask people to think about sort of as we enter into this new age.
And then lastly, I just want to point out, kind of as the Federal Voting Rights Act has been weakened, one of the things that we've done here as an organization and coalition is push for voting protections in our Michigan Constitution. Also, along with that, as we talk about federal census or federal census data, there is the Michigan Voting Rights Act legislation currently that Senate Bill 402 would create an elections and voting and elections database, right? So this is something where our in-state agencies would be able to help us in Michigan make sense of fully identifying everyone and helping to really color in that full representation picture. So there are things that are happening in state. We can insulate ourselves or delay some of the some bad things for a little while, but we've been good at doing that here in Michigan in terms of protecting ourselves. So it's something, yet again, another advancement that we're pushing for to help keep the people of Michigan safe and build towards that broader democracy.
Well, thank you all so much for your time today and sharing all of this great work, for traveling to Detroit, for being here with us in this room today. So as we close out, a big round of applause for you all. Oh, great. And just a reminder that we have some real opportunity here, some action steps that you have all outlined. A, there's an opportunity to leave some public comments, so please do so. B, talk to your neighbors, please build connection with your community. And also C, find community that grounds you, especially in all of these hard times. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. We are collecting the microphones up here. All right. Anybody else got one hiding in your purse? Bring it up here. Just kidding. Just kidding. All right. Yeah. Oh, you do? Oh, thanks. See, Nellie had one. All right. Thank you again, John, Mita, and Michael. That was very, very insightful. I know there was a lot of things that we are leaving with and thinking about. Thank you, Nellie, for the reminder about the actionable items. We hope today that you're leaving gathering with fresh ideas and inspiration to continue the important work for supporting civic and community engagement in the communities you serve. If you haven't yet given us your feedback and participated, the collage is still in the back corner there, and there's the opportunity to put your stars in the jar and other things that Nellie mentioned as well.
So we're hoping that you found this work helpful, and that no matter what your work is every day, that you find this community engagement and civic participation as part of all of our collective missions, and that we'll focus on civic and community engagement at the foundation of supporting more equitable communities now and well into the future.
So in follow-up, you're going to receive an email with access to all the resources shared today and a brief survey on your experience. Please share your feedback with us. It helps us to think about future learning opportunities. We also invite you to follow and connect with our online and through our social media networks. We encourage you to use the hashtag #WeAre501c3. You've seen that in the room. We've talked a little bit about that. But the #WeAre501c3 hashtag is about elevating the great work that nonprofits are doing. It's about your work, not the work of M&A and not the work of CMF. It really is about the work that you're doing. Please join me in thanking again our speakers for today, the catering staff from Cooking with Q, and the staff at the Durfee Innovation Society, and we really appreciate all of you joining us today.
Now I have the single most important announcement of the day. Single most important announcement. Snacks and refreshments are available in the hallway. Just saying. And for everyone, if you're a member of CMF or M&A and you pre-registered for the networking reception in the arcade, which is located just outside the auditorium from 3 to 4 o'clock. So join us there, and we look forward to seeing you. And please enjoy and have a great day. And we, again, thank you for sharing your time. We know this is a very